Welcome to Acura. I'm James Carden. Last month, 40 years since Mikhail Gorbachev was selected as the 8th General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union following the death of Konstantin Chernenko. Shortly after Chernenko's funeral in Moscow, the Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney asked Secretary of State George Shultz when he thought serious change might begin in the Soviet Union. Shultz answered with one word: today. And Shultz was right. In a span of 3 years, Gorbachev declared an end to the Cold War and changed the world. We have with us today a distinguished panel to reflect on the man and his legacy. Ambassador Jack Matlock was Ronald Reagan's principal Russia hand. He worked closely with the Soviets in the 1980s to bring an end to the 4 decades of war. He served as senior director for European and Soviet affairs on the National Security Council, and then from 1987 to 1991 as U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. Geoffrey Roberts is Emeritus Professor of History at University College Cork and is a member of the Royal Irish Academy. A historian, biographer, and political commentator, he is a renowned specialist in Russian foreign and military policy. His latest book is Stalin's Library, A Dictator and His Books, from Yale University Press. David Speedie will be moderating today's proceedings. He's a member of the Acura board and was founder and director of the program on U.S. global engagement at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs in New York. And last but certainly not least, Acura's president, Katrina vanden Heuvel, whose friendship with Gorbachev spanned 30 years. She is the editorial director and publisher of The Nation magazine and is an expert on American politics and U.S.-Russian affairs. So, David, I'll hand things over to you and our distinguished panel. Thanks.
Thank you, James. It is a distinguished panel indeed, and I'm privileged to moderate this discussion with 3 individuals who are singularly qualified to discuss the legacy of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev as you said, General Secretary, and later the first and only president of the Soviet Union. William Taubman, in his biography of Gorbachev, relates the anecdote where he apologizes for being delayed in delivering the product, as it were, to Gorbachev. And Gorbachev replied wryly, "Well, Gorbachev is hard to understand." In our brief time today, I know that Katrina, Jack, and Jeff will enrich our understanding of the man and his time. Jack, you were, as James said, in very, very remarkable vantage points. First of all, at the NSC from 1983 to 86, and then, of course, ambassador to Moscow in 1987 to 81. During that time, I believe you played a key role in every U.S.-Soviet summit, including, of course, the historic meeting of Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev in Reykjavik in 86. What were your initial impressions, your own personal initial impressions of the man Gorbachev, who created such a bit of a kerfuffle in Washington? And how did they evolve over time? And also, how did a fervently anti-communist president, Ronald Reagan, find common cause with even a reformist Soviet leader in such a remarkable fashion?
Well, there are a lot of questions there. Regarding Gorbachev, our initial impression was that he was first of all, a younger and more vigorous Soviet leader than the ones, the Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. They were all infirm and quite elderly when they died. Suddenly, we had a much younger general secretary. Now, the CIA, at least the head of it, not all the were telling us that he could be more dangerous than the others. And we did note, for example, that unlike Brezhnev, for example, when we met with him, he didn't look down and at his notes and talking points. He knew what he was going to say, and he said them reasonably succinctly, and so on. So it seemed to us that this was a different sort of leader, and what I tried to do was to design a policy that would test how far he would go in various areas of interest to us. Now, within the Reagan administration, we had to, in effect, oppose many of the hardliners or the neocons. Actually, Reagan, although he, of course, was a criticism of communism, he was one who understood that if we went after the system itself, that was going to make things harder. So one of the things he agreed on early on as we developed a negotiating posture was that we would not attempt to change the communist system inside, that our problem was they're forcing it on other peoples, and we needed to stop that. So, so within the administration, the idea was that we were trying to find ways to cooperate. I would say that Ronald Reagan was a person who did not know a lot of history and so on, and he actually had adopted a number of I would say inaccurate understandings of what was going on in the Soviet Union. So I was encouraged to, actually instructed when I was on the staff to develop, in effect, a college course. We would call it sort of Soviet Union 101. What I found was that Ronald Reagan was eager to learn. He understood that he had blank spots or even incorrect ones. And once you pointed that out, he would thank you. And this was one of the most remarkable things about him. But he came in with an absolute hatred of nuclear weapons and a desire to abolish them if possible, and also to create peace. And so in that sense, as we develop policies, we started, instead of laying everything out publicly and complaining, or we would go to them first privately and say, we're thinking of this, we're thinking of that. Do you have any reaction? Are there other areas that we should be looking at? And that was one part of it. The other part was that we formulated finally in a speech, and speech Reagan gave before his first meeting with Gorbachev, a policy which was based upon cooperation. We set forth a 4-part agenda and spoke of cooperation. So cooperation to reduce arms to the lowest possible level, particularly nuclear weapons. Cooperation to reduce conflict in third areas. And in the speech, Reagan, in one of his speeches, he said, for the first time, we don't blame the Soviet Union for these wars. We know they stem from local conditions. The problem is that they are encouraging one side and supplying one side, and we're doing the other. We need to end this cooperation and proxy wars. And then the third was we must cooperate to improve respect for human rights. We didn't say, you got to improve. He said, we must cooperate to improve. And finally, we wanted to bring down the Iron Curtain. Unlike today, when we're trying to isolate Russia, at that time it was the Soviet Union that was trying to isolate itself. But to speak of an Iron Curtain seemed a little invidious, so I suggested the phrase, let's cooperate to improve our working relationship. And that was defined as more exchanges and bringing things down. So that was the thing. Now, another, you ask about Reagan's attitude. Before he first met with Gorbachev, he actually wrote on yellow legal pads several pages of thoughts about Gorbachev. And these are very important for understanding his view. First of all, he said, Gorbachev is not a dictator. He's got to answer to the Politburo. And therefore, we have to bear that in mind. There's only so far we can push him. And second is that one of the most important things we must do is to reestablish trust. He spent about a page and a half when it was typed up on human rights. And his thought was, we've been much too upfront on human rights. We can hammer at them publicly, and that will not help the people involved. In fact, it can hurt them. We must go private on this. And then finally, his next to last sentence was, whatever we achieve, we must not call it victory, because that will simply make the next achievement more difficult. Well, I would say that our policy since the end of the Cold War has been the opposite of those that we set forth. And that actually worked in ending the Cold War.
Okay. Thanks a million. That's wonderful, Jack. Some real insights into the relationship. Jeff, would you speak to Gorbachev's vision of a common European home, which was never, of course, realized, but is a common thread in Russian thinking to this day? It's implicit in what they seek in the negotiations on Ukraine. And in addition, maybe address what our former colleague and leader, Steve Cohen, described as the lost alternatives, what might have been had Gorbachev been taken more seriously long-term by the West and had certain truly tragic missteps been avoided, NATO expansion, of course, notably so.
Yeah, well, let's see. There are two questions there.
I'm sorry. This was to Jeff, Jack. Sorry. Jeff. Yeah. Jeff.
Yeah.
Apologies.
Okay. Well.
Can we hear from Jeff, please?
Oh, yes.
We have limited time, so Jeff, go ahead.
Right, sorry, yes. Okay, so when Gorbachev comes to power, his aim in foreign policy terms is to resume détente with the United States and with Europe. So a new détente is the aim, with a view to bringing the Cold War to an end. Maybe not immediately, but certainly in the medium term. And the thing about this, you have to remember this, is from the Soviet perspective, way before Gorbachev, the Soviets were always wanting to bring the Cold War to an end. That was always their policy. They didn't want it to start, and they were always trying to end it. So Gorbachev was very much working in a pre-existing Soviet tradition when he wants détente, when he wants to see the end of the Cold War. And the same applies to this whole concept of a common European home, because since the early 1950s, the Soviets have been arguing for a pan-European collective security, common European collective, including the Soviet Union, including all the communist bloc bloc countries. So Gorbachev's concept of a common European home was a continuation of that policy, and that policy, of course, bore some fruit when you had the 1975 Helsinki agreements. Yeah, very, very, very important. So, but Gorbachev wants to go beyond Helsinki. He wants to deepen the integration, the cooperation, the collaboration across political, ideological frontiers in Europe. And of course, post Gorbachev, under Yeltsin, definitely under Putin, that whole perspective of a European-wide approach to security involving Russia continues until today, maybe because, of course, now the Russians talk more and more about Eurasian security rather than European security. So there's been a bit of a turn away from the common European home perspective, but I think that can change. That can obviously change. I think there could be a reversion to a Gorbachev type perspective, but of course that depends on having partners in Europe who want to collaborate with you in creating the common European home and a safe space for everyone. And obviously at the moment that is not the case.
Okay. I have to ask you about very briefly about the Iron Lady, her fascination with Gorbachev, a man we can do business with. That's even more strange than American leadership. Tell me, was she really fascinated by some exotic new species of new leader, or was it deeper? Was it a real rapport?
Well, Gorbachev was obviously, I think, never met him, but quite personable. Yeah, and one kind of a relationship with him, I think. I mean, Katrina could tell us more about that. But no, it was political. It was political in the Thatcher's case, and all the European leaders as well, because just remember, we're all old enough to remember the impact that Gorbachev had when he started implementing all these reforms: perestroika, glasnost, rewriting Soviet history, opening up to the world. I mean, it's quite incredible things, and that had a huge impact on everyone, I think. So, including people like Thatcher, died in the war, anti-Soviet, anti-communist Cold Warriors, are absolutely convinced that Gorbachev is serious in wanting not just to change his own country, but to change the whole world. So that's why Thatcher embraces Gorbachev as a partner.
Yeah, as did obviously Kohl and Genscher and others.
Sure.
You say.
Everyone, Mitterrand, everyone.
Mitterrand,
a common kind of phenomenon.
Yeah. Okay. Katrina, I'd like to ask you about Gorbachev's, basically about the reforms. Was it ever realistic to hope that a better sort of situation, a better version of the Soviet Union, which Gorbachev really wanted? I mean, he wanted, if you want to call it the Soviet Union light, but a social democratic with the Soviet Union persisting. After all, Gorbachev, as Jack pointed out, came to power after a pretty sclerotic series of leaderships under late Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and so on and so forth. So that was a pretty barren soil for new ideas. So,
but
what do you think?
I think that, first of all, Gromyko liked to say that Gorbachev was kriminalny молодой, criminally young, which I use all the time. But, just as with Thatcher, we were talking about Thatcher, she had in her advisory group Archie Brown. Someone, I mean, he may not have prevailed, but she did have counselors who understood the importance of Gorbachev. In addition, when she came to Moscow years later, she's the only woman on TV who beat back these horrific Soviet Russian commentators. But put that aside, Gorbachev came to power, as Jack well knows, and Jeff, with a brain trust. I mean, Chernyayev in designing foreign policy, Shakhnazarov. There were, 5 or 6 people Steve and I did a book called Voices of Glasnost, and in it you had economists, you had poets, you had political analysts. These were people who formed the Shesti Desyatniki, the 60s people, who later came around Gorbachev after the Khrushchev thaw moment decades before. If you have one party, Steve liked to argue, as did, I think, Ilya Ehrenberg, you have different factions within it. So you had a Gorbachev coming out of the Communist Party. You had Zyuganov, who's still in his office with hammer and sickle and Yuri Gagarin and an icon, or you had, Ligachev, and you had Yeltsin. So, but I do think Gorbachev was the most radical leader of a nuclear country who was for abolition. And I think the common European home is an extraordinarily important idea, which Gorbachev became part of, because it, as Geoffrey said, it had been part of the European discussion. It's tragic now that rearmament seems to be the common purpose of Europe. But the speech he gave, I have little props, at the UN in 1988 is probably one of the most visionary speeches about security, redefining security, which seems to be so critical if we're going to have a peaceful world. He cared deeply about that, but he also cared deeply about glasnost. The economy was not his forte. I mean, he did have some good advisors, but people used to say to him, why didn't you start in the economy like in China? Different system, the collective farms, etc. But he cared deeply about glasnost to the point where he helped fund the newspaper Novaya Gazeta, which continues today, which is where so many of the journalists have been killed. He and Raisa Maximovna donated she donated her book proceeds. He donated much of the Nobel money to Novaya. And when his wife died, which was so tragic, one time in Russia where people did admire her, that was hard because Raisa was at his side all the time, which was kind of not the Russian tradition. But when his family left to go to Germany and Gorbachev was alone, his son essentially became the Dima Muratov, who won the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago. So that he ended his life at a dacha outside Moscow, reading Pushkin. He had hopes for Putin. He hated Yeltsin. I continue to this day, and I'll end, that how you think about the 90s defines you in a sense, because if you think it was a time of great hope and energy, and I mean, if you forget the looting of the country, which we've been reminded of by Wayne Mary's secret cables, not released till this year, how that turned Russians against Americans, Gorbachev was pained by that. But I do think a socialism with a human face was possible. That's why he admired Steve, because he'd been reading Bukharin and Samizdat form. But there it is. But I will say that he changed our life because we couldn't get a visa from 82 to 85. And we got a visa a day after he came to power. I just want to say that Ambassador Matlock ran an embassy. There was a Perestroika Glasnost embassy. He had great evenings with cultural and political figures. And it was an open place. And it's tragic today to see how little dialogue and exchange there is.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
I'd like to come back
I
to
think one of the most interesting things we were able to do with Gorbachev was to establish, very substantial debates at Spaso House on, that is the residence of the ambassador, on internal Soviet matters. I know that in one case we had, discussions of Stalin with both Soviet and others. I think Steve Cohen was at least on one of them. A lot of those we got speakers who could carry them out in Russian, and we would have members of the parliament, once they had an elected parliament, discussing such things as First Amendment rights in the United States. At that time, we actually, abided by them on the whole. And so this was almost unprecedented. We would have evenings with a seated dinner and then a microphone, and up to maybe 120 people at tables discussing these things, sometimes with the speaker with Russian or with an interpreter. and they were often as a matter of debates with the Soviet specialists and so on. We discussed things like the black market in Russia and then the Soviet Union. So I think we did play a key role in discussing openly these issues, and this was only possible with Gorbachev. Earlier, when I had been in charge of the embassy and had tried to organize such apolitical things as poetry readings, where we would read, have the poets and their translators read poems in Russian and English or Ukrainian and English. And the KGB actually tried to prevent Soviet citizens attending these. I tried this twice when I was in charge of the embassy at different times. So even before Gorbachev, they tried to interfere with even, you would say, the most non-political activities of the embassy. But with Gorbachev, we had open access and people were not afraid to come. In fact, many said it was a privilege, to be invited to Spaso. And we tried to make every evening so substantive, even if it was not a public discussion, even if it was 24 people around the table, we would initiate, a discussion. I had Yeltsin several times when he was out of power, who would come and also discuss his issues. So the comparison with what had been earlier in the Soviet Union, when the embassy was very much restricted in the ties it could have, was simply like night and day.
Wow.
The focus on Gorbachev and these very substantive and perhaps not as well known as the nuclear weapons issue, but they're the exchanges that are so critical and so missing at this point. Back to a little bit about Gorbachev the man, and I'd like each of you to weigh in on this if you would. He obviously he had a high degree of self-confidence. At one point, didn't he say, "If not me, who? If not now, when?" So he clearly saw his part as being transformational, and he was the man to do it. And yet, he obviously had some, shall we say, missteps in terms of assessment. For example, did he underestimate Yeltsin because of his contempt for Yeltsin? The coup in August 91, the coup attempt in August 91 was led by some of his most trusted inner circle, appointing people he'd appointed. So where is this? This is back to Gorbachev is hard to understand. On the one hand, very confident, on the other, vulnerable in judgment, perhaps. Is that, Katrina, would you like to weigh in on that first?
Gorbachev used to say that he didn't have a blueprint for reform. He had some of ideas. I think this may be disputed, but he rode the wave in some ways because he was pushing and pushing. And then what happened, as happens often to a reformist transformational leader, is the interregional group of deputies, not to get too insidery, but with Sakharov and Afanasyev and more radical perestroika, were pushing him on one side, there were conservatives on the other, and he didn't have a base at a certain point, which I think played into the abolition of the party, that article, but he had real enemies, which he didn't want to engage with, I think. I mean, it's extraordinary how much change took place in the former Soviet Union without much violence. I may be disputed on that, but he really believed in the principle of kind of a nonviolent transformational reformist path. But he did do an extraordinary amount, even only in 6 years, if you think about how long Putin's been in power. But the trend from glasnost to the economy, to moving a country from a authoritarianism to a kind of democratization, opening up that bailiwick, so to speak. But he was sure of himself, perhaps to ignoring looming dangers. But he was confident, and I think he did have allies till the very end. But, you know, there was a sense in this country, Jack and could talk to this, there were people who believed he was Stalin in Gucci shoes till the very end. They just didn't believe he was making the changes. And I think he wanted, you know, he wanted to do a lot in a very quick amount of time. And that's always difficult and can be fateful if not planned.
Yeah. Yes, isn't that, I'm not swept away by this Gorbachev or some such thing. There were people who, Scowcroft, I think, was another who was skeptical, and I'm sure others. Jeff, do you have any reflections on Gorbachev, the man? Or
well, I'll just respond to what Katrina says. Yeah, I mean, he did try to do a lot. He did achieve a lot, but maybe that was the problem. You know, he tried to do too much, and he tried to achieve too much. You know, too fast, too quickly, and you know, he lost control of it. And in retrospect, you can see he wasn't as good as an effective political operator as he needed to be to operate in that particular environment. You know, because the aim of glasnost and perestroika wasn't to destroy Soviet socialism; it was to reinvigorate it, democratize it, pluralize it. Yes, you know, he comes to pay. He, like all good communists, he sees socialism and communism as be in the future, but obviously within a democratic framework. But what he ends up doing, you know, he ends up creating conditions in which the whole system collapses. Then after the collapse, of course, we have what happens in the 1990s, and the 1990s in Russia anyway, not in the West actually, completely destroys Gorbachev's historical reputation, doesn't it? Because you know, most people still today don't blame Yeltsin for the 90s. They start off by blaming Gorbachev. Yeah, that's
I think
he's the one.
Geoffrey, don't you think they fuse the two as opposed to trying to understand Gorbachev 6 years? He gets blamed. And the end of the Soviet Union, this I get from Steve, who wrote a paper on the 10 reasons. I mean, he ended up with one he disliked was that you had two men at one time. But it was also the abolition of the Union. 3 leaders went into a forest. Anyway, but the fact that he had a radical flank, Gorbachev did, or a so-called, that I think played a role because they were his perestroika from the beginning.
Yeah, I think he was unlucky as well in relation to the economy. You know, because it's the economic crisis that develops that really in the 1990 particularly that really undermines his political base. I think he's also unlucky in his friends and allies actually, because there's all this like goodwill coming from the West, particularly from the United States, but they're not really helping him very much.
No,
in practical terms, a bit more luck on the economic side, and a bit more help from the West, constructive, actual input, and he might have been able to pull it off. He might have been able to oversee, a more gradual, less traumatic transition to some kind of Scandinavian type, social democracy. Yeah. In the end, that's where it came to, and it wasn't an impossible aim.
He didn't care that much about the economy. That's terrible to say, but he really cared about the glasnost. And glasnost and perestroika were animated by a deep anti-Stalinism. And that was part of so many of the revelations and rolling back Stalin, and not just in the press, but the idea of taking apart the administrative state that had been born under Stalin and trying. But you can't just talk your way. And people reading newspapers on the street were absorbed with all the revelations, but you can't eat the newspaper.
Exactly. I mean, that's Gorbachev's huge thing, isn't it? And I think it's really relevant today. It's the importance of politics. What you can achieve through politics. So in foreign policy, what his big thing was, we get peace. We get
Right.
stability through politics.
And
Security
85%
through,
of
that's
the
the-
European missiles were cut.
Yeah.
I mean, there
with,
were
with the
real
INF
gains.
treaty, it was a huge step forward. But that emphasis on politics was also his kind of Achilles heel, yeah, because also the economic context was also important. And I don't think the impression I had, when he wasn't just not interested in the economic side, he didn't really understand the economics, or at least the economics of the Soviet system and the way it works and the dangers there were. In terms of the kind of policies he was trying to pursue, and I'm not sure he was particularly well advised on the economic front, or at least not as well advised as he was, in relation to political issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Jack, it would be remiss to have a conversation like this without talking a little bit about the nuclear weapons issue. And that's, of course, something else that Gorbachev, like President Reagan, cared deeply about. And you've written about this, but it would be worth hearing just once more from you. How close did we come in Reykjavik? An extraordinary summit, obviously, with what it did achieve. But give me some of your reflections on Reykjavik these 40 years later.
Well, at Reykjavik, they came very close to agreeing to eliminate nuclear weapons by the year 2000. And they didn't come to an agreement there because Reagan was determined to continue the research effort for strategic defense. And they had almost bet his presidency on this. And Gorbachev kept saying, well, no, although Gorbachev tended to give him an out, that for 10 years we could work on it without confusion. Now, in order to convince Gorbachev it would be in their interest to develop strategic defenses, Reagan had offered also to eliminate ballistic missiles. Now, this was something that he insisted upon, and it was not cleared through our military. They would have opposed it, of course. But Reagan really believed it, and in drafting the letter to Gorbachev proposing it, every time I would go to our interagency group, they would say he can't offer that. So I would leave it out, and Gorbachev would say, put it in. This is the sentence it's going to say. But Gorbachev didn't really pick up on that. If Gorbachev had said, okay, let's have a joint program, Reagan would have tried to do that. But he didn't. So there was a misunderstanding in both sides. But it was clear that even if they had, in principle, decided to move to eliminate nuclear weapons in 10 years, a lot of things had to happen. And in fact, when we came back from Reykjavik, the first instructions I had from our national security advisor then, John Poindexter, was develop a scenario of what we have to negotiate to reach zero.
Wow.
I did that, and it went up to Poindexter the day before he resigned over the whole Iran-Contra.
Wow.
And that controversy took everybody out of the Reagan administration who was supportive of this. So that's one side of it. Second is, it does seem to me that it would have taken a lot more negotiation, and it would have taken probably, it would have taken a successor who also wanted to eliminate them. And that was not at the top of the first President Bush, and particularly his national security advisor, Scowcroft, was not in favor of moving toward zero nuclear weapons. So In the Reagan administration, it was Iran-Contra that took out of our government the people supportive of this. So that's one issue. I would like to make a few comments about Gorbachev's internal policies. What was so remarkable to us then, watching it, was how many things he had to deal with at once.
Mhm.
Look at any one thing, whether it is the East Europeans sort of throwing off the communist systems, which he
Yes.
actually assisted, and then internally dealing with this. Now, he clearly wanted to keep the Baltic states because he was hoping that they could be supporters of reform of the whole country.
Oh,
And he was also, I think, very much misled at times by the advice he was being given the KGB because they were giving him false information about some things. The remarkable thing there was, if this came to our attention and I tried to correct him when I saw him, he would accept my word.
interesting.
That I thought was absolutely remarkable. At one point, this must have been in 91, in a meeting with Baker. And when the whole matter of Yeltsin came up, he told Baker, he said, you know, Yeltsin has been asking your ambassador what the United States would do if there was an unconstitutional change of power. Now, that was in a private meeting, and when he came out and we were riding to the embassy, Baker told me that, and I said, that's absurd. And that Yeltsin never even hinted at anything like that. And he said, well, you better let Gorbachev know. So I called Chernenko, his assistant, and told him, and if I wanted a meeting, and I told him in the meeting that there was nothing to this. And he said, well, that he was in the meeting with Gorbachev, and he heard Gorbachev say it. And he said, I'll tell him there's nothing to it. But it would be better if you told him directly. And I said, sure, just get me an appointment. And it happened that the very next day, I got a fairly routine letter from President Bush. And it was one that on a technical matter that normally we would have just sent to the foreign ministry. But I called Chernenko and I said, I have a letter and perhaps I should see him given our conversation yesterday. He got me an immediate appointment. And I told Gorbachev in that appointment that there was absolutely nothing to that report. And Gorbachev said, well, it comes from his own people. And I said, I don't know who it comes from, but it just isn't true. And as I walked out of that meeting, Chernenko turned to me and said, that's very important. Thank you for setting him straight. Now, you know, by 1991, we had the sort of relationship that if a false report came to us, I could get a personal meeting with him and he would take my word. So, I mean, the pressures that man was under was absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
Because, you know, most people either looked at arms control or Eastern Europe or what was happening internally in the Soviet Union and saying, oh, he made this mistake, he made that mistake. Well, of course he made some mistakes. And the most thing was he trusted some of the people, particularly, the KGB chief, more than he should have. And my attempts later to warn him about the coup that came, he didn't understand. But one thing, I didn't name the people because we couldn't prove. And I didn't want to go in and say, you know, that your prime minister and your minister of defense and your chief of security are conspiring against you. I had been given the names, but no proof. So I just simply had to say that we have reports that are more than rumors, and that there could be a coup against you. And he,
Jack, I'm sorry. I'm afraid we're about to lose our airtime, as it were. These
okay,
reflections are very, very helpful and illuminating. So I think it's time to wrap up. Is that so, James or Stuart?
Well, we'll know in a minute or so.
Oh, sorry. I saw what I thought was the screen. So, any final reflections from Katrina or Jeff Roberts?
Jeff?
I just a current reflection. I was very taken what Jack said about his advice to Reagan about on the human rights issue, and he said, "What we need, we're concerned with human rights, but what we need to do, we need to cooperate to improve human rights." Yeah, and it seems to me that kind of approach is very relevant today. There's lots of things about the current regime in Russia which aren't very pleasant. It's not problematic, in various ways. But the way we deal with that is that we need to cooperate with Russia to improve that situation and all the values that we think are important. So that for me is a very important takeaway in terms of my thinking about what we're trying to do in the present in relation to relations with Russia.
No, I think Geoffrey's absolutely right. As we sit here, we think of what the alternatives are. And the idea of redefining security, which Gorbachev did as a leader, and he continued to afterwards. He spent the last years of his life with Global Green. He understood the climate peril. And I think those are lessons we can learn. And also, I hope this is the beginning of pushing against the narrative that Gorbachev was a failed leader, that he did little. And we've all, I think, spoken in different ways to what he tried to do, did to an extent that others could pick up on it someday. So I feel that it's important to continue to talk about his legacy in the broadest possible way. And I remember one last thing, she passed away about a month ago, but I always found it interesting that Reagan, in his history lessons, took from Suzanne Massey that Gorbachev had been baptized. And just that little thing, but he also took away a proverb, trust but verify, which I think Gorbachev finally said enough at one of the meetings summit. He said, I know. So maybe our motto is distrust but verify as we approach. But we need dialogue, and Gorbachev was, if anything, a dialoguer, a kibbutzer, he was a long speech maker, but his words mattered. And so let us begin with these sessions and continue forward. Thank you for participating. Jack, and let's record our story about Iran-Contra, the unintended history.
Yeah.